Ayes 106, the noes of 15. Clause 3 will stand part. We now move to Clause 4. The question is that Clause 4 stand part.
Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Chairman, just before I address Clause 4, I've got to record my surprise at the Greens voting against this. Legislation as a whole. In an international world where we rely upon international organisations like the IMF to make the world a better place, I'm surprised that the Greens are voting against this legislation. In fact, I have to say that I regard that as fringe behaviour. I really do. I'm surprised that the Greens are not supporting what is a key international institution that actually, not all of the advice that the IMF has given over the years to developing countries as to how they should conduct their affairs has been correct. I'm not saying that, and I can agree. I can see why the Greens would be critical of some of the advice that was given to developing countries to, for the government to move out of all provision, etc. And some of the advice that was given to Russia, for example, as it came out of communism, was terrible advice and led to the rise of oligarchs in a way that would have been avoided had the transition to a democracy had been better. But to say that the IMF shouldn't be able to change its percentage contributions in respect of these important funds that are increasingly coming from developing countries like China, who have emerged as economic powerhouses, not to update the IMF legislation to reflect that change, I think is wrong and fringe. So, having said that, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, can I deal with Clause 4? I have an amendment before the committee to delete this clause, and I want to explain why. The legislation that this updates was originally passed in 1961. Since then, there have been, and I've just mislaid my piece of paper here, there have been a number of amendments to the Act when the articles of the IMF have changed. But they're not so onerous as to not have been within the ability of this Parliament to consider and debate on their merits. Articles of the IMF have only been changed on 4 occasions before this since the Act originally came into force in 1961. That was in 1968, 1976, 1992 and 1998, plus this change. Those changes can have significant long-term effects, and I understand that even if the Act doesn't come before Parliament, the effect of the government, which has authority to represent us at IMF meetings, the effect of them agreeing to a change in quota, or even if they disagreed and the requisite number of members did agree to a change, we're bound to go along with it unless we pull out of the IMF. I understand that. But I don't think that means that these changes, when they are coming about, shouldn't be debated by this Parliament. And I think one of the reasons why it's important is that, for the very reason that we've heard in this debate, governments can be selective about the advice that they take from the IMF, and we actually don't get all that many occasions to debate the inconsistency of positions taken and why it is that a government might be taking this bit of advice but not pursuing a capital gains tax or not pursuing changes to monetary policy, etc. So I think that these sorts of debates are useful in Parliament and important. So that's why we in the Labour Party think that when the IMF or our arrangements with the IMF are changed in this fashion, they should be debated in Parliament. They're not normally urgent. It's not like we have to disrupt an urgent business and go into consideration of the IMF changes. We can put it on the order paper and consider it when the government has a bit of time. And that's evidenced by the fact that these changes there are 2 sets of changes here, one which relate to an agreement in 2008 at the IMF and another one in 2010. And here we are, five years later, just putting it into effect in the legislation or getting closer to finalising it. So it's not like this has to be done in a rush which disrupts normal parliamentary business, but it should have parliamentary scrutiny and it should, in accordance with due process, come before us. So what Clause 4 does is says that in the future it doesn't have to. We're going to abandon the practice that we've had since 1961 which is whenever there's a significant change to these our arrangements with the IMF, Parliament gets a chance to debate it. Well, all of a sudden, the government says, well, we don't need to do that in the future. The government will just give, Mr Chairman,
Honourable David Parker.
The government will just give effect to that by way of order in council. So the scrutiny that we had at Select Committee, the discussions that we have in this Parliament, they will not be necessary in the future. The government will just do it all by order in council, and we don't have the opportunity to debate it. So, Mr Chairman, I think that's wrong. The Labour Party thinks that's wrong. We don't think that the Schedules 1, 2, 3 and 7 of the Principal Act, nor Schedules 1 and 2 of the International Finance Agreements Amendment Act 1966, or Schedule 2 of that Amendment Act, none of those acts, none of those schedules ought to be able to be amended by way of order in council. Just to put that in perspective as to what the financial consequences can be of these changes, currently New Zealand has to pay up 25% of our commitment to the IMF in paid-up capital to the IMF, and the IMF uses that for various reasons, for various things. In addition, we can have capital called up from us up to the total of our quota, and there are other related lending arrangements where the IMF call on us to make good our promise to help other countries by lending direct to these countries that need a hand for a while. And when the IMF tells us to do that, we have to do it within a set period. Now, if that amount changes dramatically, it does have dollar consequences for our country. Indeed, when changes are made to increase the amount in the IMF fund, but New Zealand's total commitment doesn't go up, it causes us to reflect on the fact that relative to the size of the world economy, we haven't been growing. We've been getting smaller share of the total world economy rather than a greater, and that in itself is something that should cause us to reflect in New Zealand whether we have our economic settings right. So, Mr Chairman, for those reasons, the Labour Party is proposing an amendment to this clause, or we're actually proposing that this clause not proceed. The provisions of the Act set out, of the amendment bill, set out, and the schedules will still have effect. So we're not frustrating the intent of the legislation. We're just saying if it needs to be changed again in the future, it should come to Parliament to do it rather than be done by statutory regulation.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
It was going to be one David or other, Mr.
Three
Chairman,
Davids.
almost certain. In triplicate.
I got that right.
Mr. Speaker,